Last night I took a walk into the back of my mind, through the trash and the warning signs. There was a party full of jokes and cliches. I couldn't think of anything. Just
now we have a speaker tonight, Doc Stuessers. Everybody knows Doc. He's, I guess, the last talk that I heard him give was on the butternut tree or something. Chestnut tree, which is very good, and he would drag that out again next year if we need that. Did you give that here once?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, he did?
Over here at the room.
Oh, okay. And anyway, he's got some information on 1491, the year before Columbus died, or before Columbus came, and he's gonna go. Yeah. No, you're ready.
I'm ready.
Oh, okay.
A grandson, an archaeologist in Colorado, sent me this book, titled 1491. He felt that it was the kind of thing I'd be interested in. Well, I was intrigued and fascinated by it. Then a recent National Geographic article in January of this year added to what I already had out of the book, and I filled in with some of my personal experiences and want to take a fresh look at American history. While I'm going through this, I'd invite questions or comments at any time. We're taught way back when that the humans first appeared here in the Americas 10,000 years ago at the time of a great ice age. Ocean levels dropped, making the Bering Straits an easy land bridge to North America. These humans were nomadic hunter-gatherers. They migrated south along the warm Pacific coast between the glaciers and the Pacific Ocean to a hunter's garden of Eden. There were mastodons, armored rhinos, great dire wolves, saber-toothed tigers, 16-foot glyptodons. Those were enormous armadillos. There were beavers the size of armchairs, turtles the size of cars, sloths big enough to reach up and dine off the treetops 20 feet up. There were flightless predatory birds, 3 species of horses, 2 species of camels, elk, buffalo, deer, antelope, and the list goes on and on. And none of them had any inborn native fear of human hunters, so they were easy prey. And as a result, the newcomers proliferated and quickly spread east as the glaciers melted. They moved up the Mississippi Valley, up the Atlantic coast, and south to the very tip of South America. American history, the way I was taught in high school, seems to start with the influx of Europeans. In our high school history class, we've been taught that the Americans were populated by small bands of wild pagan savages. Tribes had small populations, seldom over 2,500 people. If they proliferated and grew larger than that, they split into 2 tribes, much like overpopulated beehives. Their average lifespan was barely over 30. I have a quote from an Army scout in an old Western movie, "I smell Injuns." It's a reflection of the Europeans' idea of superiority and their disdain for the Indian way of life. Supposedly, these dirty Indians lived in teepees covered in animal skins, and they barely survived winters and animal attacks. Now, many of these supposed facts have been questioned. Archaeologists, paleontologists, and geneticists are digging up interesting, relevant facts about important parts of America's past. Archaeologists, for instance, have found evidence of an Indonesian settlement in Peru along the western coast of South America dating back to 35,000 years ago. This was doubted by some investigators until archaeologists came up with another finding. In Indonesia, they found that sweet potatoes and other native plants from Peru first appeared in Indonesia about that time, 35,000 years ago. So the Indonesians not only got here, but they got home again with these plants. Also, a lost tribe, different from other Indian tribes, existed near the capital of present-day Brazil on the east coast of South America. They were hated, persecuted, and finally militarily annihilated in the 1920s by the New Brazilians. Geneticists have examined their remains and proven them to have been of Iberian Peninsula Franco-Spanish origin. Somehow, they came across the Atlantic much earlier than 1492. The early inhabitants pursued differing courses of life and government. An old saying held that they lived on the land but left no permanent evidence of their presence. Quite the contrary, there are many evidences of their works and accomplishments in Central and South America, as exposed by our geneticists and archaeologists. A flyover in Brazil. This is an aerial view of hundreds of miles in the Amazon basin. There were fields, huge fields raised in orderly rows, and in digging in them, archaeologists find wooden tools and pottery shards mixed in these massive excavations. The fields are connected by miles and miles of canals and walkways dug by humans. They moved unbelievable masses of soil out of the swamps of the Amazon basin to build them. How could they do this? Well, they obviously had intelligent planning and direction from somebody. They obviously had thousands of laborers, probably slaves, and they worked probably for hundreds of years. In South America, great cities arose. There were 90 to 112 million people. There were more people living south of the Rio Grande River in 1491 than in all of Europe. They militarily built up huge cities ruled by emperors considered to be gods. This became a negative when the Spanish soldiers under Cortez, with a small army, took Montezuma hostage to conquer Mexico. When Cortez got back to Spain, he published the notes of his conquest. These were read by Pizarro, who then, with less than 200 Spanish soldiers, took Atahualpa, the emperor of Peru, captive. He had a huge standing army of 60,000 veterans, but they were kept from easily squashing the Spanish by the fact that their god emperor was held hostage by Pizarro. Now, some of the Incas fought back. They had no guns, but their weapons included bolas, a length of cord with a stone at each end and one in the middle, which when twirled around over their head and thrown at the Spanish horses tangled their legs, and when the horses went down, the Incas moved in to kill. They used slings to throw rocks. They had bows and arrows that were deadly to 100 yards. They had javelins, maces, and other clubs. They hurled red-hot stones wrapped in pitch, which burst into flame in midair and dropped among their enemies. The roads in Peru, thousands of miles along the coast. This is out of the book too. They were engineering marvels. Where there were steep grades, they didn't grade them level as we build roads. They fashioned stone steps up or down over the hills. When the Spanish troops on horseback chased them, the Incas could easily climb the stairs with their llamas. But the horses of the Spanish enemies had to be led up or down and up or pushed up or down. Their armor-clad riders had to dismount for this, and they were easily killed by the Incas. The Inca soldiers delighted in rolling huge boulders down those stairs to blast the oncoming Spaniards. There were many other Middle American accomplishments. They invented a system of writing, which was largely destroyed by Spanish priests. They tracked orbits of the planets. They invented a 365-day calendar, more accurate than the European one. And they invented the concept of zero. Can you imagine the present-day business and banking operated with only Roman numerals without zeros? Wouldn't work. They also set up a widespread trade network. They invented the wheel, but they used it only for toys, as they had no beasts of burden to pull carts. They built earthquake-proof buildings in one of the most earthquake-prone areas in the world. Some are still standing after thousands of years. Now, how could they do this? Well, they made the buildings flexible at their foundations, not unlike modern earthquake-proof buildings. They laid a bed of rounded gravel stones, river stone, and then put their huge stone walls on that bed and arched them together at the top. And when the earth shook, rattled, and rolled, the whole building would bobble around like a canoe on the water. Against the guns of the Spanish, the Incas fashioned cotton cloth with 500 threads to the inch. They layered it to make bulletproof vests and shields, amazingly similar in construction to our modern bulletproof Kevlar vests. The Middle and South Americans early on found much more of a Garden of Eden than just game animals. They thrived on the wild ancestors of potatoes, yams, tomatoes, manioc, beans, peas, squash, peanuts, pumpkins, pineapple, quinoa, and many more. Maize also appeared. I'll use the term maize, or pronounce it maize like the Europeans do, or just corn. But for years, science was unable to find its wild ancestor. Plant geneticists solved the problem recently, a mountain grass called teosinte, which translates to gift of the gods, like manna from heaven. It had multiple grassy stems, each bearing 7 to 10 tiny, stony hard seeds that had no use. But the Indian kids would collect them, and when they had a communal campfire, they'd toss them in where they went pop, pop, pop. When grown in warm, fertile lowlands, it quickly evolved into useful maize. In 6,000 years, hundreds of varieties evolved. A few years ago at a sweet corn roasting party, the subject of genetically engineered foods came up, and the hostess swore that she'd never feed her family genetically engineered foods. I assured her that the corn we were eating was the result of 6,000 years of intensive selective genetic engineering. Maize was terribly promiscuous. It crossed with almost anything. There are today more than 5,000 cultivars. Its only problem, the stems, dried up and tipped to the ground before the seeds ripened, as did all wild grasses, an evolutionary ploy to self-seed before being eaten by the herbivores. Then someone spotted a mutation that kept the stem green until the crop could be harvested by man. This same gene was added to wheat, barley, and oats, keeping them upright until harvest time. The early American farmers thrived on these high-calorie diets far better than on meat-only diets. Lewis and Clark's men on their trek to the Pacific without carbohydrates required 12 pounds of meat per man per day, and they all lost weight. But maize lacks the amino acids lysine and tryptophan. Beans lack cysteine and methionine. Squash, however, is high in these amino acids and vitamins. making squash with corn a good balanced diet. Modern American farmers have found that maize, corn, cannot be grown in the same field year after year without a heavy dose of nitrogen fertilizer. But the Indians did it for hundreds of years. Now, how could they do that? Well, they planted milpas. These were fields of mixed crops of maize, avocados, squash, beans, melons, tomatoes, chilies, sweet potatoes, jicama, amaranth, and peas. Many of these are nitrogen-fixing plants. They were fertilizing the corn, the maize, as they grew. Gourds were also grown. Indian villages were decorated with hundreds of gourd birdhouses to attract the native swallows and purple martins, which purged the village of mosquitoes and other flying insects. The Indians used bear and eagle grease as insect repellents, still very effective if you can buy them.
What's eagle grease?
Grease from dressing out eagles.
Oh, yeah.
Oh yeah, very good. Use it all the time. After the Europeans arrived, they eagerly carried the seeds of these plants back to Europe and Africa. Potatoes became the big staple crop in much of starving Europe. In Italy, maize assumed that role. Early on, milpas, the whole ball of wax, was introduced to Africa. Then when the potato blight spread over Europe, the mass starvation led to mass migrations to America in the 1800s, most of our ancestors. In Italy, the maize diet without squash led to an epidemic of pellagra and rickets, also leading to mass migrations to America, our Italian friends. In Africa, the enhanced nutrition from milpas caused a population explosion and subsequent tribal rivalry, eventually enabling and leading to the worldwide slave trade. An expert recently gave us an estimate that 80% of man's food today around the world originated in America. That leaves 20% for wheat, barley, oats, and rice, and the rest of it is American. Trade. There was an extensive network of trade all over America, not something we ever heard about before. This led to eventual conversion from nomadic hunter-gatherers to farming. Archaeologists have found items of trade distributed all over North America. There were shell beads from Florida all the way to Canada, obsidian and flint from the Rocky Mountains, mica from Tennessee, silver from Ontario, shark's teeth from Chesapeake Bay, copper from Canada, quartz for arrows and knives, and various soapstones and a mali soap plant that comes from the desert southwest, and somehow it was traded all over in North America. All of these things were. How many of you have heard of Cahokia? Arm up.
What was that?
Cahokia.
Cahokia.
That's what we'll talk about. It was located just east of St. Louis on the Mississippi River. You were there, good girl. It was the center of trading in North America from about 1100 to 1400, almost 300 years. It was the largest of the Mississippi mound builders tribes. There were more than 50 of these tribes from Minnesota to the Caribbean. We have one in Wisconsin. Aztalan State Park.
Oh, asphalt. Yeah.
That was one of the mound builders. Perhaps the mounds were for religious purposes. That's the way it's taught, I know, right now. But I doubt that. Most likely they were defensive structures with stockades around the top of the mounds. And the elevations, they had sharp 70-degree walls up to their mounds. archers had a decided advantage over approaching enemies on level, open ground. Cahokia's mounds with stockades, that's the one. Here's a artist's drawing of what Cahokia was like in its heyday. Those mounds were as high as a 10-story building. This National Geographic's article shows the layout of the Cahokia, and here's a typical mound builder's layout from archaeologists' work. Trees and brush were kept down around the mounds, and their elevated vantage points prevented surprise attacks. An enemy would have to scale the 70-degree walls with his longbow, and any shot would probably go off into the wild blue yonder. And all the while he'd be dodging a rain of deadly arrows from above behind the stockade. There's an old military rule: never attack uphill. Always defend from elevation. Robert E. Lee made almost a fatal mistake. He wanted to assault Little Round Top Hill against the advice of his aides. They mounted 5 big attacks and were absolutely slaughtered, and he finally gave up. I had a show of the advantage and disadvantage of elevation. I'm an old bow hunter, shot deer, turkeys, grouse from tree stand. I was up in my tree stand one evening ready to quit, and a flock of turkeys came in and roosted right up in my tree. Oh, yeah. And I immediately found out it's very hard to draw a 50-pound bowstring up in the air, and harder also to aim it. Well, I fired 2 arrows into the wild blue yonder and went home. Never ruffled a feather, thinking to myself, I'm glad they weren't shooting back.
Well, I was gonna say, what did they do back to you when you're underneath all those
They
turkeys?
might have done it. Cahokia had permanent housing for 15,000 people. We talked about small villages. There were 15,000 living there, with another 15 to 20,000 in nearby suburbs, we would call them, other tribes around. Maize farms on the rich surrounding farmland, present-day Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, and Missouri, some of the richest farmland in the world, fed them. Then abruptly, in about 1400, it was suddenly and completely abandoned. No one has been able to give a reason, but this entire area is underlain by the New Madrid fault line, which produced a major earthquake, archaeologists inform us, at about the time of the evacuation in 1400. 400 years later, the New Madrid area in 1811 was decimated by 3 8+ Richter scale quakes in 1 month's time, and followed by hundreds of aftershocks. And all the resident Indians moved far away when it happened in 1811. And I contend the same thing in 1400 caused the demise of Cahokia and the loss of the entire Mississippian culture. Today, just east of St. Louis, Cahokia is a state park. It's worth your visit. In North America, the development differed from South and Middle America. For centuries, the Indians continued as hunter-gatherers, requiring huge amounts of meat. This led to the loss of many of the large prey animals, their extinction. They learned to use fire to help herd these animals together for easy kills. They also used fire to burn the prairies yearly to provide continuing pasture for elk, deer, and buffalo. The Indians created the vast fertile prairie lands of North America by keeping down the brush and trees for centuries. The traders brought seeds and plants from South and Central America and taught the North American Indians how to use and to grow them. They settled in as farmers, but without beasts of burden. They favored sites along the coast and on streams and rivers. Canoes were their fast trains. They planted extensive milpas, taking advantage of lessons learned from Middle America. They built large underground storage pits so they could enjoy maize, potatoes. You got a pretty bird out there, I know. They could enjoy maize, potatoes, squash, beans, and so forth year-round. One Indian described the fish and fowl available on both coasts as much plenty of migratory ducks, geese, passenger pigeons, spawning salmon, short-nosed sturgeon, alewives, striped bass, and American shad, and with maize and the other Middle American vegetables, it was a healthy diet. Villages became permanent with peaked roof houses. Teepees were only for short trips. Most of the year, they lived in permanent wooden houses. At the time of the Pilgrims, there were miles of fields of maize. Milpas lined the New England coast often for miles. Columbus and other explorers and settlers arrived, and they described the Indians as beautiful of stature and build as I can describe. They were strikingly healthy, taller than Europeans. Here's what went back to Europe, how the Indians looked. Their diet was incredibly nutritious. Adults averaged 2,500 calories per day. Compared to the Europeans, they got about 2/3 of that. Then another quote, they were as proper men and women in feature and limbs as can be found. The men were handsome, the women were beautiful. They had no pox scars and no evidence of rickets. They were more amiable to behold than English dandies. Go back to another of my stories. In 1960, about, the Menominee Reservation in Wisconsin was converting to Menominee County. And the State Medical Society was concerned that they didn't have decent medical care. They had an old 2-story wooden hospital that was condemned by the state inspectors, and they had one old drunken Army doctor, and so some of us went up there to try and rectify it, find out what we had. And we raised money and hired a health survey crew from no less than Harvard. And they spent the summer with the Menominees and came out with their summary report saying that in essence the Menominee people were across the board healthier than their white neighbors in the rest of Wisconsin. Okay, a little bit about the kids in those days. English kids at 6 or 7 were sent out as servants to the rich or worked long hours in sweatshops, while Indian children from infancy to puberty were free to play and roam. They explored the countryside. They learned to identify Osage orange trees that were used to make bows. They had an interesting game where they padded reed arrow tips and competed by shooting at each other, learning to shoot and to dodge arrows. They were all excellent swimmers. They bathed daily, even in winter, using various forms of soapstone and amali soapnut. They had foot races, swimming races, and played lacrosse, a less violent but more skillful game than our hockey or soccer, and could be played on any rough, uneven surface, which our games can't be. In warm weather, the kids camped out in the surrounding forests, often for days or weeks at a time, learning survival skills. The Indian canoes were faster and more maneuverable than English boats. Moccasins were better than the boots the English wore. When wet, they dried out quickly and did not get hard or crack. The Indians soon learned that in serious discussions with the English invaders, they would do their bargaining at 100 yards. The English musket balls would plop in the dirt at less than 50 yards. but almost any one of the Indian men could, with their long bows, could drive an arrow through 2 men at 100 yards. Sometime around 1000 AD, the Indians of the Northeast gave up their hunter-gatherer life and settled down with the agricultural trinity of maize, beans, and squash. Populations soared, and as a result, competition led to fighting, and revenge inspired brutal attacks, and from this brutal environment, a heroic figure emerged. Deganawida, the peacemaker. He was an outsider who was born to a virgin girl far to the north, like other great religious leaders. He moved from village to village of the 5 great tribes, the Seneca, the Cayuga, Oneida, Mohawk, and the Onondagas. He had some sort of a speech impediment. It sounds like he just had a bad stutter. But he teamed up with a great orator named Hiawatha. Incidentally, he was the prototype for Longfellow's Hiawatha in the poem. When he met a chief, Deganawida would hand him an arrow and dare him to try and break it off snap. Then he would bind 5 arrows tightly together and hand them back to the chief, who couldn't break them. And then Deganawida would say, "You see, united we stand, divided we fall." Now you wonder how we know the history of the North American Indians. They had no written language, but each tribe had a historian, a chanter, a recounteur, for some of you, an Eddie Faber.
So give him the flyby.
Whose duty it was to recite the tribe's history from creation to the present at all big tribal gatherings. His other duty was to pick and train a successor to pass on their history, ensuring continuity. Deganawida in 1142 laid out the New Alliance rules entitled the Law of Peace. The union of the 5 great tribes was called the League of Nations. When issues came up before the alliance, the council head would summon 50 representatives from all the tribes. They were called sachems, we'd call them senators. The brightest and best from all the clans, unlike some of our senators. The sachems upheld the laws, settled land disputes, negotiated treaties, controlled foreign contacts, and declared war. And this is the real scruncher. All decisions of the council had to be unanimous. Can you imagine if the Senate sat down with a problem and, by God, when you're through, you want a unanimous decision? The sachems were chosen by the clan heads, who were all women, but the sachems were all men. Their term of office, no problem with recalls. They were in as long as the clan chose to keep them. It might be a week or a lifetime appointment. In all important matters, the sachems had to submit the matter to the decision of the people, a referendum, we'd call it. Compared to the despotism that prevailed in Europe and Asia, it was a libertarian dream and a feminist dream. Clans were largely governed internally by female clan heads. Great law explicitly ordered council members to heed the warnings of their female relatives. No woman could be a war chief and no man could lead a clan. Women held title all land. Men could not consider a matter not brought to them by their women. Women could veto decisions by the council or demand reconsideration of any decision. When our Constitution was formed by the likes of Adams, Jefferson, Madison, and Franklin, they had no pattern for democratic government from Europe, but they were all aware of the laws of peace, and many parts of our Constitution were based on them. Equality and freedom for all. Slavery was banished. Our courts still do require unanimous decisions to convict a criminal. That's a rare thing across the world. But when the 13 original colonies got together, they could not overcome the states' rightists' demand for slavery to be available. The Indians had Social Security. The entire community cared for widows, orphans, and the aged. When crops were harvested or meat taken, the choice portions went to these three groups. They also supplied the needy with firewood. A few quotes of the Indian opinion of their invaders. Quote, "They possessed little intelligence, were physically weak, sexually untrustworthy, atrociously ugly, just plain smelly. Most of them hadn't had a bath since the day they were born. And they carried filthy white silk handkerchiefs instead of spitting their secretions to the ground." One tribe denied an English trading ship landing rights. The men of the tribe lined up on shore with their long bows. They did finally allow offshore trading from ship to canoe. And then as the ship unfurled their sails to move away, the men of the tribe, still all lined up on shore, turned and showed their bare buttocks to the Europeans. They were mooned by the Indians. An interesting study. Indian children raised by whites returned to the Indians when they grew up. White children raised by Indians and then freed returned to the Indians when they could. They had loving families. Now, how could these early white settlers overcome the League of Five Nations and the mighty Aztec and Mayan empires? Well, the Spanish took advantage of the god-emperor status to paralyze their military power, and smallpox did the rest. Imported diseases were the biggest ally of the Europeans. Malaria came with the Pilgrims. Governor Bradford of Jamestown wrote, "The good hand of God swept away great multitudes of the population to make room for us. God made the way. More than 50 northeast villages were vacated by disease. The bodies of the last survivors were all that was left. There were repeated waves of typhus, smallpox, yellow fever, diphtheria, influenza, and measles, and the Native Americans had no immunity. It is estimated that diseases killed at least 95% of the Native Americans. There is a question of whether some diseases went the other way from America to Europe, and the big suspect was syphilis. The first recorded case of syphilis in Europe was in 1495 in the Spanish nobility that had contact with Columbus's men. In 1804, Lewis and Clark, on their epic voyage to the Pacific, bivouacked halfway out the first winter with an Indian tribe. They had loads of trinkets and beads and other items to trade with the Indians for supplies and favors. By the time they finally reached St. Louis a year and a half later, almost all of the enlisted men had syphilis. And then, in a recent study of 687 ancient skeletons from Middle America, 40% showed signs of syphilis. Syphilis was an American disease. Now, how can we ignore our Indian heritage? 1/4 of our states have Indian names. Michigan, Minnesota, Illinois, Wisconsin, Dakota, Missouri, Nevada, Delaware. Madison's lakes and thousands of our cities have Indian names. Chicago was the Indian name for the putrid swamp at the lower end of Lake Michigan. It's now Chicago. Yet there is a constant squabbling over naming our best young student athletes Chiefs or Warriors or Indians or Illinois. It seems to me to honor them rather than put them down. I still prefer Verona Indians over Verona Wild.
Yes.
Yes.
We should teach our students to be proud of this heritage, just as we should be proud of the American founding fathers who tired of European aristocracy and adopted the great laws of peace, divided authority, freedom and equality for all, no slavery, united we stand, divided we fall. Perhaps if we had insisted on this law, we could have avoided the Civil War with over 600,000 casualties and half of our country laid waste. With the Gana we Dawes, laws of peace, we have led the world to democracy. I sure hope we don't screw it up.
Very good. Very good.
I think there's an excavation at that Cahokia place too, a dig.
Oh, yeah, well, it's
That's what we
seven-story building. They had to dig the dirt out
Yeah.
to build it up. It's truly fantastic what they did.
The number of people that were around is kind of surprising.
Yeah.
You don't
If it hadn't been for the white man diseases, the white man would never have got anywhere in this country.
Yeah.
There were huge tribes all over.
Yeah. And
Is
they
that
were,
book, is that book in the
able-
library here?
I don't know. My book, I can't offer it to anybody because I've been through it so many times and taken pieces out and it's all broken up. But it's an interesting book. It is disorganized. It was very difficult. I ended up making notes and about things I wanted to include in this discussion with the page number so that I could try to make an outline and a flowing pattern of the story.
Did they discuss in there at all, like, I don't know what year it was, way back when the Plain Indians used to burn off the plains. The fire went clear to the East Coast and killed hundreds of thousands of people.
Well, as a matter of fact, you know, when we had the big eastern forests of chestnut,
Yeah.
they didn't burn. Because under these dense chestnut trees, there was no brush and no grass, nothing grew. There's a, senilities of which. There's a Indian story, Cooper? Anyway, running through the forest for days.
Yeah.
There was no brush, no nothing. And it didn't burn until the blight came through and killed the trees and all the branches fell and all the brush and trash grew up and then forest fires swept through.
Yeah.
But the way they were in 1491, they didn't have forest fires.
Well, that was very interesting.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Hard work.
Yeah.
Doc,
Yeah.
Doc. Is there a possibility we could make a copy of what you just told us to attach to our minutes? Because
Well,
there's no way that I could take and summarize what you said.
That would take you only a couple of days.
Well, my notes are sort of,
Well, they'd be better
It'll
than
be on the
nothing.
disc,
What?
it'll be on.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll have
Yeah,
a
mine-
CD on
Okay.
part of this is typed and part of it is
it. Embellish.
embellished.
Last night I took a walk into the back of my mind, through the trash and the warning signs. There was a party full of jokes and cliches. I couldn't think of anything to say, and so I slipped into the men's